Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the key to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Welcome back to the Project Management Prepcast, where we help you identify ways of passing your PMP exam. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner, and welcome back to part 2 here in our lesson on Identify Risks. In part 1, we provided you with an overview of the process, introduced the main concept to you, discussed important aspects of the processes, reviewed the inputs and their importance, and began our discussion of the tools and techniques. We just finished off with the documentation review at the end of part 1. We're now moving over into part 2. We'll finish up the discussion of the tools and techniques, introduce and discuss our single output, the risk register, and do a quick review. We will begin by looking at all of the information gathering techniques. And under the headline of information gathering techniques, we understand techniques such as brainstorming, the Delphi technique, interviewing, and the root cause analysis. Let's start with the first one you've probably heard of before, brainstorming. In its most basic form, brainstorming is a group creativity technique designed to generate a large number of ideas for the solution to a problem. For the purpose of risk management, it can be used with the goal of creating a list of risks. Now, the list may not be comprehensive, but if done well with the right participants, I'll bet it'll get you pretty close to a comprehensive list. It is typically performed by the project team, aided by a group of experts, typically subject matter experts from other areas and risk experts who are not themselves part of the project team. Often, ideas about project risks are generated with the assistance of a group facilitator. And some advice: get somebody who's really very experienced in facilitating this type of session. The meetings can be run as a traditional free-form brainstorming session or a more structured mass interview approach. Using the risk breakdown structure can provide an excellent framework for categorizing or grouping the risks that you have identified. While it may seem chaotic at times, brainstorming, if done properly and facilitated well, can be a very productive exercise, both in identifying risks and planning the responses. In addition to brainstorming, project teams can use a method called the Delphi technique to identify project risk. The goal of this technique is to gain consensus from a group of risk experts' questions anonymously about project risk. And here is how the process works. A facilitator begins by giving each expert a questionnaire that is designed to solicit ideas about important project risks. The risk experts then provide responses to the questions in the survey. Again, this is done anonymously, which removes many impediments that might otherwise affect the outcome. The responses are then summarized by the facilitator, again maintaining anonymity, and the summaries are then recirculated to the experts for further comment. A consensus is typically reached after a few rounds of the process, and it can yield some valuable information about project risk. Some advantages of this technique are that it can significantly reduce bias in the data and minimize any one individual or group from influencing the outcome. The Delphi technique can be used to identify risks for any individual phase of the project or the project as a whole. Checklist analysis is next on our list. Risk identification checklists are typically part of an organization's process assets that have been derived from historical information and come from prior projects. Those that come from previous projects that are very similar to your current project are of course the ones we want to analyze. One of the steps in analyzing a checklist for use on your project could be to ensure that you have risks identified for every category from your risk breakdown structure. So if you do not have risks for all of the levels, all of the categories, then there's something missing. So you're going to add this to your checklist, just a checkpoint that says, do you have something for every level in your RBS? That is part of this checklist. Since it's very unlikely that you or a former project manager could build a completely exhaustive checklist. Did you think of this? Did you think of that? Did you think of that? Did you do this? Did you do that? There's just no way that you can think of everything. These checklists should be used just as that. They are a checklist. They are a source of potential risks that you may have overlooked and you had not considered it. Don't think of them as being final, and once you've gone through them, everything is cleared up and everything is done. Avoid over-reliance on these checklists. Use them for what they're good for. The checklists, once again, they're probably going to be used again in future projects. So reviewing them and removing non-relevant or outdated risk information, outdated ideas, as well as adding to it, makes them that much more valuable. Two additional techniques for gathering information about risk are interviewing and root cause analysis. So interviewing is one of the most successful methods of identifying risk on your project. Your goal, through the questions and discussions in an interview, is to gather insights from the interviewee on what risks they perceive in the project. Those interviewed include risk experts, experienced project participants, stakeholders, or subject matter experts. And of course, root cause analysis, the spirit of this method is to ask why. If you identify a risk, ask, why do we have this risk? And continue asking until you are satisfied that you have found the true underlying cause. Once causation has been established, you can develop corrective and preventative actions. As you remember, we have a bunch of documents that we use as inputs. Many of them are based on certain assumptions. The project management plan has many assumptions stated, as do other plans, estimates, schedules, and so on. An excellent way to identify risk is to question and analyze those assumptions. Are they still valid? Has something changed? Did your schedule change? Is your estimate based on resources that are no longer available? Has there been a strategic shift in your department or company that would invalidate your initial assumptions and now introduce new risk? Have you accounted for all of them? What about that critical person on your project that is the only subject matter expert for a particular area? What would you do if she became ill or took another job? These are referred to as single points of failure, and many a project has been derailed by not recognizing or ignoring them until it's too late. Do you have these lurking in the shadows of your project? You better identify these and have a planned response. Some assumptions carry more weight than others because if proven invalid, they could affect multiple project objectives. Reliance on a single supplier that experiences a setback could leave you scrambling and could affect your ability to deliver on schedule, at a particular cost, and at the quality that your customer is expecting. Again, that is risk that must be identified and analyzed. And finally, you should confirm that assumptions are consistent with themselves and don't contradict other assumptions. Our final analysis technique is called the SWOT analysis, which stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. SWOT. This analysis is the process of examining the project from each of these four characteristics. For example, the SWOT analysis for a construction project of a commercial building complex may look like this. Strengths. We have a lot of construction experience in our company. weakness, our experience lies mostly within the private sector, building private homes and not with commercial buildings. Opportunities, this will enable us to grow into a new market as well as differentiate ourselves from being just a pure home construction company. But threats, the resources on the project may not feel comfortable working in this new construction environment. As you go through the 4 dimensions of strength, weakness, opportunity, and threats, you can evaluate how an organization's strengths can offset a weakness or how opportunities may outweigh or overcome a threat. As you might expect, the amount and type of risk identified in this analysis is highly influenced by risk attitudes and tolerances of the organization. One always needs to be aware of the enterprise environmental factors and sometimes correct for or push back on them to reach the goal, which is to identify all risks. Another weapon in our arsenal of risk identification is called diagramming techniques. And yes, this is as simple as drawing a diagram, but what kind of a diagram? Well, there are 3 types of diagrams that you need to know of. First of all, we have here the cause and effect diagram. They're also known as Ishikawa diagrams because Mr. Ishikawa created them. They're also known as fishbone diagrams because, well, take a look. It sort of looks a bit like a fish, with the bones inside of it. These diagrams show your effect on the right-hand side and your potential causes feeding into this from the left. They will enable you to illustrate how these potential causes may be linked to the problem that you see on the far right. For instance, have you ever had a problem? You fixed it and then later you found out that you didn't fix the right thing and the problem just came back again? This proves that you failed to identify the real root cause of the problem. The cause and effect diagram, the fishbone diagram, the Ishikawa diagram here, is designed to help you avoid this situation. Next, we have the system or process flowcharts. You have definitely seen those. It's boxes and arrows that show how a process flows, and each step is in a box and an arrow is connecting them. And here on the screen you see a possible flowchart in regards to figuring out, hey, my lamp doesn't work. Why is my lamp not working? Process flowcharts can help you anticipate where and what kind of risks may occur in the documented processes, because it's much easier to understand a process when you see it described in such a visual way. And this graphical view is also very powerful because often risks are identified as you are drawing them out. As you are drawing a box, suddenly, a lamp goes on in your head saying, hey, this could be a potential area, this box that I'm drawing right now, where a risk could happen. Our third and final diagramming technique is called an influence diagram. An influence diagram is a simple visual representation of a decision problem. Influence diagrams offer an intuitive way to identify and display the essential elements, including decisions, uncertainties, and objectives, and how they influence each other. These diagrams contain boxes of various shapes and colors that represent decisions, changes, objectives, and general variables about the problem that is shown in the diagram. We have also heard them called by the name of relevance diagram because they show which factors in a problem are relevant to the other. And once we took the 13 inputs we had and applied a Swiss Army knife of techniques to them that make up the identify risk process, there's really only one output, and that is the risk register. Obviously, it contains a lot of information, and it is one of the most dynamic and most often referenced document in any project. The risk register is part of the project management plan. Another document in the project management plan is the risk management plan, which contains intervals or a schedule for conducting risk management activities, which again are all iterative. Remember, we said at the beginning of this presentation, identifying risks is an iterative process. We weren't kidding. So What is in the risk register? Let's take a look. Some of the contents of the risk register are the catalogue of risks, which is the list of all your risks that you have identified on the project. The list should also contain an initial risk response, those that were easy to find, that you instantly were able to say, oh, this is a risk and here is a possible response to this. These will serve as inputs to the plan risk response process. The register can and should, to the extent possible, contain root causes of risks, so it will likely contain diagrams like a fishbone or a cause and effect diagram. There should be a complete listing of updated risk categories, and a final and important point to make is that in this phase of project risk management, the risk register contains only the start of what will be a lot more content. The output of the risk analysis process will be added, as will the output of the plan risk response process. What would you guess is used to monitor and control risks? Yep, the risk register. Through iterations of each of these processes, identify, analyze, plan responses, and control and monitor the risk, the register will grow larger and larger and larger and become more and more valuable, both to this project and future projects. In order to do a proper job of analyzing our risks, a standard structure or format should be imposed for recording our risks. And here we're talking about risk statements. A risk statement is a way of documenting your risk that provides enough information to determine the probability of the risk occurring and areas and degree of impact the risk poses if it is realized. A well-constructed risk statement provides a clear description of the current condition, the associated risk event, and the impact if it is indeed realized. It uses a consistent format that is unambiguous and supports effective risk analysis and response. This format enables the project team to compare a single risk and its relative impact or probability to others that we have on the project. An example for a risk statement might read something like this. Given the change in scope being considered, it is likely that a large part of the software must now be written in C++. The time required to obtain additional resources and rewrite the code will extend the project's schedule by 3 months. Here, the current condition and cause are stated. Given the change in scope being considered, a large part of the software must now be written in C++, as is the associated impact. The time required to restaff and recode will extend the project schedule by 3 months. All right, finally, we'll discuss the types of risk that you will encounter on your project. We have 2 general categories for risks: pure risks and business risks, and we try to place each risk into one of these 2 types, into these 2 categories. A risk is considered a business risk if it contains both the opportunity for gain or loss. In other words, it's those kind of risks that contain both a threat for financial loss and the opportunity for financial gain. We can, however, categorize a risk as a pure risk if there is only a risk of loss. Examples here are floods, bad weather, fire, criminal activity, things like that. These risks can usually be insured, which is why they are sometimes referred to as insurable risks. Are there any other type of risks? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because we also have known and unknown risks. Known risks are those risks that we can anticipate today, either with or without much certainty. For instance, we know that our competitor is also working on a similar product. Therefore, there is a known risk that we will have to share the market with them. Or We do know that there is a motorway being built. It will be opened up in 1 year, but we cannot be 100% certain what this means for us. Will this bring more or less traffic to our supermarket and thus clients purchasing from us? Unknown risks. Unknown risks are risks or situations that we cannot imagine today. We have no idea that this could even happen. For instance, in the year 2005, who could have imagined Lehman Brothers Bank would break down, that the US government would not save them, and that this would be the beginning of a global financial crisis? This was unknown and unimaginable at the end of 2004. The unknown risks are, of course, those that will cause you a headache later on, and for which you will then need to find a workaround once they pop up. The only thing you can do is put aside some contingency reserve and hope that it will be sufficient. Your risk register may or may not contain information of what type a risk is. So what type of questions do we see in sample tests, online, in books, in simulators? One of the more simple questions that we have seen showed you a cause and effect diagram, and it simply asked, what type of diagram is this? That is the moment when you not only must be able to recognize it, but you have to know that it's known by 3 names: cause and effect diagram, Ishikawa diagram, or fishbone diagram. A similar question was the description that we are sending out emails to various specialists, and we're asking for their anonymous input towards risk. And the question simply was, what technique are we using here? And the correct answer is, of course, that we are using a Delphi technique. And another very similar question listed various characteristics of the Delphi technique. Your task was to identify the false characteristic about this technique, and you won't believe what the false answer was. The false characteristic that you needed to identify stated that the Delphi technique is an ancient Greek technique. Well, the Delphi technique is obviously named after the ancient town of Delphi in Greece, but it is not an ancient Greek technique. In other questions, we saw descriptions of a risk, and you had to decide whether the risk was a pure, insurable, business, known or unknown risk. And finally, one scenario-based question that we saw was quite interesting. The question explained and described various risk management activities and tasks that the project team was performing in the risk management processes, but they did not specifically say which processes these tasks were from. And the question then was, which risk management process has the team forgotten to execute? So your job was to first relate the tasks in the question back to the 6 risk management processes, and then secondly, you had to work out that identify risk was the one process that they had in fact forgotten. A great way to do that is, of course, by first of all knowing what the risk management processes are and what the activities are that you do there. But then you also need to know the table 3-1 from the PMBOK guide. That is, by the way, the same table that is repeated in appendix. It's table A1-1 as well. And you need to know this table by heart. And as you sit down to do your PMP exam, you get a piece of paper and you draw out this table in the first few minutes of your PMP exam, so that you have this table with you, in front of you, as you are taking your exam, so that you can refer back to it. This will make this kind of process identification so much easier for you. Let's review. Identify risks happens early on in the project, and then again and again and again and again throughout the whole project lifecycle. The project manager, the project team, customers and other stakeholders are involved in this process. This is an iterative process, and the goal is to determine which risks might affect the project and document their characteristics. Identify risks is truly the responsibility of everybody on the project and not just the project manager. There are several methods to identifying risks, like brainstorming, interviews and the Delphi technique. Those are the most common ones. And then, of course, we have just one output, and that is the risk register. And this concludes our look at the Identify Risks process. But before we go, here are some study tips for you. And the first one is, of course, don't study on the day before or the day of your exam itself. Instead, just simply relax. Your study plan should focus on regular studying over a period of several months, trying to cram everything into your brain, let's say in the last 5 days prior to exam. That is not a good approach. And worrying about it and trying to catch up during the last 24 hours is not going to make a difference. It's better to be relaxed than to be worried about wanting to reread a chapter from the PMBOK guide. And with that, we have come to the end of this lesson. So it's time for Justine and myself to bid you farewell. Justine?
Au revoir, mes amis.
Until next time.